Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video lecture on supervising counselors in training, a primer for site supervisors. My name is Dr. Tom Field. I am the program chair of the counseling program at Oregon State University. We are hoping this training will be helpful to you, regardless of whether you've had supervision training before, whether you're new to supervision. We hope that this will give you some grounding to work with our students. So let's get into the overview. We're going to, in this training, be talking about the following 6 things: expectations of site and faculty supervisors of the Oregon State program, goals of supervision, things to work on with your student, supervision styles and roles, things that you are attracted to that kind of guide your work, supervision models, theories, that kind of dictate how you do supervision, formats of supervision, individual, triadic, group, those types of things, and of course, evaluating supervisees. So let's start out with expectations of supervisors. Faculty and site supervisor roles are different. Faculty supervisors at Oregon State are essentially the instructor of record who is teaching the group supervision section and is the person who is submitting all of the evaluation materials, as well as meeting with students during group supervision and providing consultative services to the site supervisor. So, faculty supervisors are responsible for evaluating students, remain in contact with the site supervisor throughout the field experience, provide support and guidance as needed, remedial training as needed to the student, and provide 1.5 hours of group supervision per week. Sometimes 2 hours, just depends on the class. I'll also note here that remedial training is important to note. If the site supervisor feels that the student has areas in which they need to grow, that can be communicated to the faculty supervisor who initiates the growth plan or the plan for success. The site supervisor, their responsibilities to directly oversee the supervisee's interactions with clients and the setting that in the setting that they're in, to assist the student to adhere to policies, procedures, and demands of the site. That's important to us that our students are following site requirements, and to be providing 1 hour of individual and triadic supervision per week. Now, I'll note, you're probably wondering, well, what happens on a week that I have to miss? It has to be an average of 1 hour a week, so you can make that up on other weeks. If you have to miss 1 week, you can make it up with 2 hours the next week. The supervision contract that you all will be signing, if you haven't already, defines the purpose and goals of supervision, activities at the site that the student will engage in, logistics like the frequency of supervision, the duration of supervision, roles and responsibilities of faculty, site supervisors, and supervisees, the evaluation methods to be used, and then reporting procedures for legal, ethical, and emergency situations. By and large, the student's meant to reach out to the site supervisor in a case in which there is a client emergency. The faculty supervisor was only be notified as kind of a backup, as a kind of a last ditch person to reach out to. It's also important to note here that in many of your roles, you will have both an administrative task and a clinical supervision task. What we mean by that is, for example, let's say that you're the person who's responsible for billable hours at your site, or maybe you're a school counseling supervisor and you're responsible for making sure that all school counseling duties get met within a site. You may have conflicting kind of priorities in working with the supervisee, right? One level you want, for example, a supervisee to be growing, to have good experiences. On another level of your work, you may need some things to be covered or need to make sure that certain things are getting done. So obviously that's a difficult balancing act, but many of you have that kind of mixed or dual role responsibility. About half of all supervision appears to be provided by individuals with those dual roles. And so if that's the case, I think you just disclose that to the student and then do the best you can to balance those roles. Okay, let's talk about goals of supervision, things to work on with your supervisee. Here are some questions for you to consider. What outcomes are important to our trainees? How do we want them to be growing? What do we want them to be demonstrating by the end of an internship experience? What do they want or expect from us? And how does my supervisory style impact the achievement of desired goals for supervision? Here are some factors that impact the supervisory relationship. Trust, So that has to be established first. Anxiety on behalf of both supervisor and supervisee. Parallel process, I mean, that's a psychodynamic term. It means that client dynamics between counselor and client show up in the supervisor-supervisee relationship. Supervisee transference and also supervisor countertransference. So the supervisee, for example, may approach the supervisor from a position of prior knowledge, meaning that they are supplanting or projecting certain aspects of their past experience onto the supervisor. And the supervisor could do the same to the supervisee, right? Adherence to ethical guidelines. That's important. That definitely can impact the supervisory relationship. And it's something I'm sure all of you are going to be well versed in, understanding the ethics of supervision, understanding, for example, the need to have pretty clear boundaries in the relationship and not do things like counseling with supervisees. And actually, that's an interesting point because, as we'll talk about in a minute, there are forms of supervision models that talk about using counseling skills in supervision, but in a way differently that you would do formal psychotherapy with supervisees. Racial and gender identity interactions. What we mean by this is, from a cultural perspective, those interactions do influence the way in which we develop trust, the way in which we work together, right? And so, for example, if you have a power position based on your identity, let's say you're a person who identifies as white, or you're of male gender, or maybe a white male, those positions of power are going to influence how the supervisee relates to you, right? And how you relate to the supervisee. And being aware of that and how that can influence your interaction, your relationship, can be important to attend to. In addition, if you're a person of color or a person of, say, or maybe a woman, you're a person who identifies as non-binary or trans, or a person of other kind of minoritized identities, that's also going to influence how you approach the supervision relationship. And so just being aware of that and even bringing those pieces into the discussion, I think is very healthy, because then, of course, the supervisee starts to think about their own identity with their clients and what they bring into the room with their clients via the parallel process. Okay, role conflict and ambiguity next. So this can be challenging at times, right? You have to evaluate a supervisee formally, or at least give information to faculty that is evaluative in nature. You also have to develop a relationship with the supervisee and develop a relationship of trust in which, to some extent, you're going to be more nurturing towards the supervisee as well as challenging. And at other times, you may be, for example, even eyeing this person as a potential candidate for employment. So once they've graduated. So you have all of these different roles that you're holding. We've already talked about the administrative role, and it's your goal to try to figure out how to balance those things, and those factors can all impact the relationship. Also, the amount of disclosure by the supervisor. Self-disclosure is helpful, of course, to an extent, right? And there are going to be some supervisees who need reassurance that, oh, this is very normal, this experience is something that most counselors go through, or those types of disclosures can be very helpful. And in general, actually, it's prohibitive if the supervisor doesn't disclose much at all of their own experience. The clinical skills and knowledge of the supervisor, of course, are going to impact the supervisory relationship, because the supervisee is going to respect your own kind of approach and expertise more if they feel like you have good skills and knowledge that they can lean into. An acceptable supervisory climate of warmth, trust, and respect. Matching the supervisee's level of development. We'll talk more about that when we look at developmental models, but essentially, in a nutshell, if you have a supervisee who's fairly novice, for example, a very early practicum student, that's like pre-internship, they're going to require a lot more direction, right, than a supervisee who's towards the end of internship, who's going to want actually quite a bit more autonomy. And matching that, so for example, if you come across as someone who is much more laid back and wants to give a lot more autonomy to a kind of entry level student, who's just starting practicum, that match may not go so well. And same the other way, with if you're overly kind of directive with a kind of late stage intern, you may find that they're, well, to some degree, kind of adolescent, right, in how they approach that feedback and guidance from you. They may want just more autonomy. Providing constructive feedback, that's easy on paper, right? Quite difficult in practice to be able to be supportive and also give important areas for growth without coming across as overly punitive or critical. Being flexible and available, as we know, as you know very well, things change in schools, in clinics, right? In organizations. All of a sudden there's an emergency you have to attend to and what have you. So just being available to students as they need it, for example, during crisis situations, and also being flexible with when to meet and around the needs of both supervisor and supervisee. The emotional bond in the relationship, the degree of trust plays a large role in this. We think of emotional bond as almost like how much can I lean into you, right? As someone I can be vulnerable with, as someone I can tell you the areas in which I'm struggling. And then mutual agreement on the goals and tasks of supervision. What we mean by this is, do we feel like we're heading in the same direction together, right? Where the supervisee has a sense of where they think they need to go, and the supervisor sees it the same way. And if there isn't that kind of mutual agreement, there's going to be some degree of schism that could arise, rupture, from the supervisor feeling like the supervisee isn't working on the right things, or vice versa. I think there are three primary goals of supervision in most situations, and here they are. Enhancing competency and self-efficacy is the first one. What do we mean by this? Well, it's this idea that we want to support a person's skill development, right? Knowledge development. We want them to practice with more complicated situations. If they're a school counselor, we want them to try school counseling guidance lessons that are more challenging, or we want them to be doing small group work, maybe with some children or adolescents who are more advanced in some of the concerns they bring. If they're a clinical mental health counseling student, perhaps they need to work with different populations, or try couples therapy, or maybe even try working with substance use, or attend medication management sessions, and all these different kind of ways in which a person can grow during their practicum and internship. Then in addition to that, in addition to just pure knowledge and skills, we also want them to be developing as a counselor in their own identity and in their own kind of professionalism, and how they approach just being a professional counselor. And that looks like everything from showing up on time, being prepared for supervision, thinking clearly about who they are as a professional and knowing their own limits, also knowing how to take care of themselves. And then we have last, protecting client welfare. So I think this is really important. That has to come almost first. We have to, regardless of what else we're doing, make sure that the client is okay, and also make sure that we're doing no harm. And so let's say that we have a pretty challenging client situation or student situation, if it's a school situation, and you're thinking this could be a really good learning opportunity for this student. You have to also ask in your mind, is the student ready for that? And is it going to potentially backfire, right? Is it a pretty high risk of not protecting client welfare? And maybe the student needs additional support around this case. I think in most situations, in my experience, most practicum and internship students can do really, really well with taking on some pretty challenging situations if they have support, and that's really the key. Let's take a look at the first area, enhancing competency and self-efficacy. So this builds off of, especially the self-efficacy piece, Bandura's concept, which was the conviction or belief that one can successfully execute desired behavior. So basically one's belief in themselves, right? The impacts of this are important. For example, whether or not a given task is attempted depends on self-efficacy. You won't start something if you don't think you're going to complete it or be able to complete it. How much effort is spent on the task, how hard you work at it, and how long a response is maintained in the event you face obstacles and stresses. Okay, so in other words, if you believe in yourself and in your abilities, you're more likely to initiate and also persist in the task. And that's very pertinent to counseling, right? And counseling clients and students of different kinds of challenges and needs, because we want the student to be able to take on challenges and persist. And so addressing self-efficacy and belief in oneself is important early. we want people to develop this kind of self-concept of, if I persist and finish the task that I might typically fail, I actually know then that I actually can succeed in something I didn't think I could before, right? And that's what helps efficacy to increase. So in other words, if you only give easy, straightforward tasks to someone, it doesn't build self-efficacy. What self-efficacy tends to develop from more complicated tasks that a person does complete successfully. Okay, that's the first area. The second was facilitating counselor development. There is a very famous and important developmental model called the Stoltenberg and McNeil model. Has 3 levels. I think it's very helpful as kind of a schema, you know, a way to approach, understand supervisees. The goal here is to move supervisees to more advanced developmental levels. So a level 1 supervisee would be your kind of beginning practicum student, right? And hasn't had much clinical experience before, right? It's just fresh coming into the field. They may lack confidence. They may be self-conscious with their performance and anxious about evaluation. They may also feel a bit confused about professional behaviors expected. For example, it could be anything from professional dress, or it could be showing up on time in a certain way. It could be how to approach supervisors for help. They may have discomfort that motivates their actions. For example, they're more likely to help clients out of a place of not wanting them to be uncomfortable, which makes them uncomfortable, rather than having clients sit in discomfort, which at times can be very important therapeutically. They can also be highly dependent on modeling and direction and supervision, right, and needing your guidance. So the supervisee kind of continues on, develops, and eventually they become more engaged in the process as a level 2 supervisee, less preoccupied with their own individual performance, more interested in learning. They become more confident in their ability to empathically relate, aware of and attuned to the worldview of the client, but also sometimes struggle to retain objectivity. They're almost so close to the client that they're unable to be able to, for example, diagnose them. They may struggle with that, or struggle with this idea of, well, how are they actually doing, rather than how does the client self-report that they're doing. They can be somewhat erratically motivated at this juncture, transitioning from dependency to autonomy and supervision, at times needing more guidance and support, at other times preferring more independence. And that can be challenging for supervisors, right? To know, what does the supervisee need from me in this moment? A level 3 supervisee demonstrates marked self-assurance, so their confidence is built and grown. And this would be, I would say, a late stage intern, even post-grad for some of our students. Demonstrates objectivity and intentionality, so understands, for example, how a person is doing overall versus just how they self-report. As an example, that is aware of the dynamics of counseling that can occur, such as interactions between counselor and client, and how that influences the relationship and goals that are being worked on. Consistently motivated to enhance skill and identity, and functions independently and responsibly. At this point, they don't want as much help from you, right? They want you to just be more of a facilitator. In a way, it kind of mirrors parenting. I hate to say it, but early parenting, the child comes to you and they need a lot of help and guidance, right? A young child. And as the child turns into a teenager, they want very little of your help, right? They want you to leave them alone so that they can learn things independently. And that actually can be more of a struggle for the parent than for the child and adolescent. And I think in some regards, it's kind of the same for the supervisor, right? That the supervisee can move through these processes without a lot of strain, but it's the supervisor who has to change their approach. So the onus is on you all as your student kind of grows and matures to follow their lead and also be providing the things that they need in response. And last, we have protecting client welfare. Training must not put clients at risk, right? And so we should be always thinking about our clients as we're serving our students. We should be assessing capability of the trainee, which can be difficult at times. You know, how capable are they, as I've talked about just a moment ago. We should also be sensitive to things like trainee impairment and unethical behavior, things like burnout, mental health issues that can arise, also boundary issues that can happen, right? Things that seem to be bordering on the unethical. of course, there are some more obvious examples, right, that kind of something that kind of is either unethical or it's definitely a performance concern, such as not completing notes in time. I mean, that's a very obvious one. But there are other things that just seem a bit off, right? Maybe, for example, the supervisee doesn't receive your feedback or makes a decision that's against policy or something like that. It becomes a conversation to have with the trainee, especially if it does have a risk of having an impact on client welfare. We should be aware of Tarisoff Case Law. The reason that I bring this up specifically is in the Tarisoff case, and many of you are familiar with it, the supervisor, not just the supervisee, was found liable when Tatiana Tarisoff was murdered by a client. And so that's something to just be aware of there, that that you have some degree of legal liability if your supervisee doesn't, for example, adequately report to the authorities someone who is at risk of harming others and has an identifiable victim. Okay, and last we have vicarious responsibility. Again, it's the same kind of idea that you do, to some degree, take ownership of what happens to the client. Not full ownership, that's still on the counselor, but if you're giving guidance, it's worth you documenting, right? I'm sure that all of you do this, but if you don't do this, it's worth, as a supervisor, documenting the types of decisions that you've made, especially specifically around crisis events or events where there's, for example, child abuse or neglect, potentially adult abuse or neglect, or suicide or homicide risk. Okay, let's turn our attention to supervision styles and roles. We typically use a variety of styles and perspectives in our work as supervisors. However, we also tend to have a predominant style or role. There are three different ones: the attractive style, the interpersonally sensitive style, and the task-oriented style. The attractive style is defined as being friendly, trusting, and supportive, right? So, not physically attractive, but attractive in that the supervisee is more likely to kind of move towards you and trust you and feel like they can confide in you. The interpersonally sensitive style is being intuitive, invested, reflective, helping the person to go deeper into their work with clients. And then the task-oriented style is associated with being more structured, goal-oriented, and also evaluative. You're helping the supervisee take care of business, basically, right? To kind of plan for working with their clients and students. Does style matter? Well, it's interesting. From research, we know attractive and interpersonally sensitive styles influence satisfaction with supervision, whereas task-oriented styles influence perceived self-efficacy. So there's different outcomes, right? I think to some degree you're going to see both satisfaction and self-efficacy with these styles, but they do differ a little bit, right, in what the ultimate goal of supervision is. And so that's something to be thinking about as you approach supervision. Okay, now we're going to talk about supervisory roles. There are three predominant roles, according to Janine Bernard's discrimination model, that the supervisor can take on: the teacher role, the counselor role, which we'll talk about as being separate than being literally a psychotherapist for your clients, for your supervisees, and the consultant role. Let's talk about supervisor as teacher first. In this role, the supervisor remains in charge, determines the direction of interaction, functions as an advisor or expert, right? Kind of gives direction, right? Evaluates observed session interactions, identifies appropriate interventions, teaches, demonstrates models, sometimes role models, explains the rationale behind directives, and formulates hypotheses about cases. So in the teaching role, you would be giving more direction, right? And kind of telling the supervisee what might be going on, what are some things to look out for, what are some ways to approach this situation you have with a client or student. Here's an example kind of case scenario that we're going to be looking at for all three of these styles. I want you to pause this video just for a moment as you reflect on what you think, how you think you would proceed as a teaching supervisor. So here's the situation. When reviewing your supervisee's work with a depressed client or student, you notice that your counselor is constantly generating options and problem solving for the client or student. Essentially, your counselor is doing the work, right, for the client or student. So if you're the teaching supervisor, how would you proceed? Take a moment, pause the video, jot down your thoughts. Okay, I'm guessing most of you, when you jot down your thoughts about that, would say something along the lines of, I would give guidance, right? Direction. I would provide examples of what to do so that the client, the supervisee understands they're being too directive in their own kind of work, right? And working too hard, and they need to be providing more active listening. Okay, supervisor as counselor. In this kind of mode, I guess, the focus of supervision is the supervisee as a person. The goal is to facilitate supervisee self-growth. And it uses counseling skills, though again is different from psychotherapy. Here's a definition that helps you to understand the difference. The supervisee does not become a client. However, the counselor supervisor, the person in that role, does utilize many of the counseling behaviors. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what does that even look like? Here are some examples. Explores supervisee feelings during a counseling or supervision session, right? What was coming up for you when you're working with that client? What's coming up for you as we talk about this now in supervision? Examine supervisee feelings concerning specific techniques. How did you feel when you tried empty chair? What was that like for you? Facilitates supervisee self-exploration of anxieties in session. Tell me how you were feeling with the client. Oh, you were feeling anxious. In what ways? And how did that drive your behavior? Help supervisee define personal competencies and areas for growth. In what ways do you feel like you're growing as a counselor? What are your strengths? What are your areas to continue growing in? Helping supervisees to process their own affect and defenses. How did you make sense of feeling anxious? What did that mean to you, right? Or I noticed that you were fairly, fairly defensive. We'll use the defensive defense view. When the client gave you feedback, what was that about for you? What are you protecting yourself against? And then addresses transference, countertransference, biases, and cultural blind spots. So, for example, what is coming up for you specifically around this client? How is this different from other clients you've worked with? What do you notice, and where might that be coming from? Okay, so that's how you would act as a kind of counselor supervisor. So let's come back to this vignette that we had from before, where the counselor is constantly generating options and problem solving for the client and doing the work of the client. So as the supervisor, as the counseling supervisor, pause the video and think, how would you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Okay, I'm sure you selected something here that went along the lines of, I would help this person understand where it's coming from for them, what's going on internally that they want to generate these options and problem solve for the client, why it's so difficult for them to sit with the idea that the client isn't coming up with the answers themselves or doesn't have a direction for themselves yet. Okay, next we have supervisor as, that shouldn't say counselor, should say consultant. So when the supervisor is the consultant, the focus is on the client of the supervisee rather than the supervisee themselves. Functions almost like a case review. You would focus on treatment planning, interventions. The goal of the supervisor is to generate information, right, to understand what's going on and then to provide their sage kind of guidance and advice. It allows the supervisee to exert overt control, right, to basically be, it's like a telling scenario, right, where the supervisee comes in and tells you all the details about the case. You will then provide alternative options instead of answers. Okay, so you tried this. That's not a bad idea. You could also try this or that. And then encourage supervisee choice and responsibility. Different than the teaching role where you're directively telling someone what to do. Here you would be essentially saying, well, here's the choices ahead of you. This is what would probably happen if you chose this choice versus this choice, and help the person understand the choices available to them. Okay. When you're reviewing your supervisee's work with a diverse client, going back to that example, right, and the counselor's overly problem solving, generates options in a way that's not proper or not helpful, As a consulting supervisor, think about how would you approach that situation differently than if you were a teaching supervisor or counseling supervisor. Take a moment, pause the video, and give that some thought. Okay, so I imagine you wrote down or thought something that went along the lines of, I would get all of the information first, right? I would have the supervisee tell me exactly what was going on. I would try to understand the options that they're taking and the other options available to them is something we would talk about. And then obviously the supervisee has the right to decide what to do with that. So you can see here that the consulting kind of role does infer that the supervisee is more advanced, that they can make good choices and decisions, that they're even perhaps aware of the different options and choices available to them. It reflects a typical developmental progression. And this is not always 100% accurate, of course, but this is a general kind of framework for what I tend to see when I'm working with master's level students across the kind of, the progression. I tend to see a level 1 supervisee as needing more teaching than a level 2 or 3 supervisee. And actually it goes down exponentially, kind of as the person progresses, they need less and less teaching. And the consulting aspect is the smallest during level 1, and it increases to become the largest by level 3, right? So early practicum student is not going to come in and be able to give you every single detail about a case in a cohesive but yet concise way, and then tell you what decisions they're making and try to get your sense on the other decisions available to them. They're probably going to come in and say and ask you questions such as, I'm stuck, I have no idea what to do with this person. And when you ask them to describe the situation, they can't cohesively describe what's going on, right? But as they progress, they can do that. And then they become, of course, a bit more to use you like a consultant, more able to use you like a consultant. In terms of counseling, that's the orange slice you see there, from level 1 to 2 to 3, I see that as being about the same. I mean, it shifts a little bit here or there, but you're going to want to help the person understand what all these things mean to them and to their identity, right? And how their own presence as a counselor kind of plays into what's happening with the client. I think those self-reflection questions are always important. I think the biggest changes I see are teaching, it declines over time, the needs for it decline, and consulting, the needs for it increase over time. Okay, we can talk about supervision models next, theories of supervision. Boom, here we go. You have different types of models. Models grounded in psychotherapy theory. We're going to talk about those the most in this ensuing kind of section. You also have developmental models, stage models, which we've already talked about. We talked about the Stoltenberg, that's level 1, 2, and 3 model. You have process-based models, lifespan models. Those are all helpful in general as kind of, I would say, overarching schematics. So for example, the level 1, 2, and 3 model, that's helpful just to appraise where your supervisee is at, what needs they have. It's not that helpful necessarily to understand what to do with them in supervision per se, right? Social role models, the third type, the discrimination model stands out here. This is, again, helpful as a schematic. For example, your role as teacher, supervisor, and counselor, right? Sorry, teacher, consultant, and counselor, and how that changes over time as the person progresses. I mean, that's, again, helpful as a schematic, but it's not going to dictate how you are in the room with a supervisee, or at least, how to help them with a specific client or student. So most of our focus here is going to be on models grounded in psychotherapy theory. We're going to talk about the psychodynamic, person-centered, cognitive, behavioral, systemic, and constructivist approaches. Let's start with just a general kind of overview. The psychotherapy models of supervision are rooted in, of course, the major theoretical schools of counseling and tend to be based also on the supervisor's theory, right? So for example, it's going to be a pretty low likelihood for you to take on a cognitive behavioral style of supervision if your own counseling approach is not cognitive behavioral. It's pretty likely that your counseling approach and supervision approach are going to mirror. Let's talk about psychodynamic supervision first. The focus is on transference and countertransference, helping a person understand how they relate to the client based on past history and how the client relates to you based on past history and the projections that therefore occur. This features focuses on supervisee insight and self-awareness. You directly discuss the supervisee's defense mechanisms here. How the past influences the present is a topic of conversation. We talk a lot about the process of psychotherapy, right? In other words, the relationship between you and the client and how the way that you respond to a client influences their own response. Conventional approaches could usually discuss key concepts such as id, ego, superego, defense mechanisms. I would say more modern approaches focus much more on process, right? The process of psychotherapy. A common approach is interpersonal process recall, which we're going to cover briefly here. What is IPR? Well, you would ask the supervisee to show video or audio tape, to play it back, and to be intentional about which segment they're playing back. Then you ask them inductive questions to expand their own awareness of interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics, right? With the goal of facilitating self-awareness. So here's some examples of those questions in IPR. What do you think the client was trying to say in that clip? What do you think the client was feeling at this point in the session? Can you pick up any clues from the client's behavior? What was running through your mind when they said or did that? How were you feeling at that point? Did anything occur which prevented you from sharing some of your feelings at this point in the session? What were those blocks and how can we help you work through them so that you could maybe share some of those thoughts, those insights with the client next time you meet with them? And if you had to do this all over again, what might you say to the client? So those are, again, setting questions, some examples of types of questions you would ask to help the supervisee reflect back on what occurred and to understand in depth the relationship with the client, the process that happened between the client, and things like the affect, all right, that's there between the counselor and the client. And things like counter-transference. Transference would just be easily accessed through that conversation. Okay, we're going to have a different case vignette that we're going to work through now and look at supervision models. So let me read through this one, and we're going to be applying each of the different theoretical approaches to this case. When reviewing your supervisee's work with an aggressive client, you notice that the counselor is constantly apologizing for confronting the client for their inappropriate behavior. They fail to make eye contact, the counselor does, and they appear physically intimidated by the size and stature of the client. Essentially, the client is in charge of the session and the setting. Okay? So if you were to observe that as the psychodynamic supervisor, how would you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client or student? Pause the video and give that some thought. Okay. I'm guessing that most of you selected something along the lines of focusing on the relationship, right? What's going on between the two of you and what transference and countertransference might be there that's stopping you from doing what you need to do, which is essentially confronting the client, right? About their aggressive behavior and then talking to them about boundaries. Okay, person-centered supervision next. The focus here is on providing the three core conditions: congruence or genuineness, accurate empathic understanding, unconditional positive regard. The relationship between both counselor-client and supervisee-supervisor has a central focus, and not necessarily things like the transference relationship, but the actual lived, trust building, warm relationship between counselor and client, and supervisor and supervisee. The long-term goal of this work is, of course, self-actualization, helping the client to be the person that they are meant to become and be, and the same for the supervisee, right? To grow in their confidence to be the counselor they're meant to become and be. The supervisee's phenomenological perception is important in person-centered. So in other words, a supervisee could have a very different perception than you of what occurred in the session as a supervisor. And your perception as a supervisor does not override necessarily the perception of the supervisee, right? So you just have to be comfortable with this idea of multiple realities or phenomenology. Okay, in-person centered supervision, same situation. The counselor is intimidated by a client and they're not confronting them as they need to. If you are a person-centered supervisor, how would you proceed with helping your client assist, so a counselor assist the client? Pause the video, take a moment, and write down your thoughts. Okay. I'm guessing you wrote something or thought something along the lines of, I would attend to the relationship itself, the trust that was built between counselor and client. I might ask or wonder, why is this client being aggressive with the supervisee, with my supervisee? They may not trust them yet, right? Maybe trust hasn't been built, a relationship hasn't been built, and that has to be established first. And maybe we need to develop some empathy into why this person has a more kind of defensive posture. Maybe there's a place of vulnerability they're avoiding there, and it's sensitive for them. And also, with the parallel process, being able to help the supervisee themselves look at, why is it hard for them to feel that sense of vulnerability with the client, and even express that? Why do they seem to be kind of avoiding the client rather than expressing how that makes them feel and being authentic with the client? Cognitive behavioral supervision, up next. Great counselors are trained, not born. The tabula rasa idea that none of us are born with innate traits, we all have to practice it. Bernard's model is very applicable here to cognitive behavioral supervision. You'll see in a moment. Supervision focuses on the following: modeling, role-playing, feedback, reinforcement, individualized goal setting, and evaluation. Okay, very action-oriented. For cognitive behavioral supervision to work, the supervisor must have an extensive knowledge of the skills required to successfully counsel another person using CBT, right? Because CBT can be quite technical. And at times you may need to role play and show the supervisee how to do a certain intervention. For example, it could be anything from a mindfulness intervention, right? Or to something like an exposure protocol. From the teacher role in cognitive behavioral supervision, you would, for example, direct your supervisee to read literature about CBT, instruct them about the use of CBT approaches, role play and model, give evaluative comments and feedback, and reinforce gains explicitly. Oh, I see you gaining in your skill here, right? Of your ability to, for example, do downward arrow technique or something like that in CBT. If you're applying the counselor role following Bernard's model, not just the teacher role, you would, for example, say things like, tell me about the last time you felt stuck with this client. What was happening just before you had that feeling? What thoughts were going through your mind? What did you do in response to your thoughts and feelings? What happened next? So it's kind of like an ABC analysis, right? Using CBT kind of ideas to help the person restructure their thinking, right? Change the way they're thinking about working with this client, knowing that their thoughts are going to lead to not just emotions, but actions, right? And they're going to lead to them feeling stuck and not doing the work they need to do. So in the case of this client, as you'll see, that can actually be quite helpful, right? To get them unstuck around the intimidation they feel. In the consultant role, following Bernard's model, to what degree is your work together coinciding with the treatment plan? Could be a question you might ask, right? What do you think about reviewing the treatment plan with your client and evaluating the degree to which goals are being met or need to be revised? So you would hear everything that the supervisee is sharing with you. You would ask for more information, and then eventually you would try to give them a sense of what the options are, right, and what they're currently doing. Well, for example, right now it seems like you're trying to avoid or distance yourself from the client rather than directly confront them, and maybe that's for good reason, right? Maybe the client will blow up if you do confront them, but maybe they won't, and maybe there are other different avenues we could explore together, so you have some options at your disposal. Okay, so approaching that situation again, if you were, it says person-centered, but if you were a cognitive behavioral supervisor, how would you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client? Pause the video, take a moment, and think about being a cognitive behavioral supervisor with this client. Well, actually, I'm sure you probably identified this. There's a lot that you could do here, right? You could, for example, take a teacher role and show them what to do, role play it, for example, how to kind of confront the client. You could also ask them questions as the kind of supervisor counselor, about what's going on internally for you, what thoughts are you having that's stopping you from being able to confront the client. You could also be a consultant and get all the information and then ask for the supervisee to share what actions they're currently taking and what other actions could be available to them. Okay, constructivist supervision is the last model. This focuses on the systems influencing the counsel-client relationship and the supervisor-supervisee relationship. The role of the family may be given greater precedence. It requires the supervisor and supervisee to be able to think at a cognitively complex level, right? To be able to think about what's happening around a person that may be influencing their behaviors, and also to be able to apply principles of narratives and solution-focused therapy in terms of what narratives are there, right, that influence your work with the supervisee, with the client, and also how might the client already be changing, right, and how can you facilitate their internal process of change. Let's look in terms of constructivist supervision at solution-focused therapy just for a second, right? Let's think about it in terms of being the teacher, counselor, and consultant roles working backwards, just like we did with CBT. So from a consultant role first, working backwards, how might you apply a scaling technique with this person? For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable do you feel being vulnerable in here? To what extent do you believe this client is a visitor, a complainant, or a customer? Those are ideas that come out of both narrative and solution focused. Visitor, meaning someone who comes in, they leave, it's just a stopgap in between their next destination. Complainant, someone who comes in with the sole destination, or sole kind of role of just sharing complaints and not receiving help necessarily, just kind of talking about the problems of the day. Or a customer, that's someone who comes in prepared, they want help with something, they ask for help. Let's brainstorm some strategies for moving this person to the customer role. What strategies have you used successfully with other clients who are not customers, right, who are more visitors or complainants? And what homework assignments have you tried with them? Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being fully stuck and 1 being not at all, where would you place your work with this client? At this point, you are asking the supervisee about their own perspective, right? Which is different than consulting. It's more client focused. How are you managing to keep it at an 8 rather than a 9 or a 10? Focusing on the counselor again. Tell me about a time when your work with the client was progressing better. What were you doing at those times? What was the first sign that you're becoming unstuck? What will you be doing differently? And what will the client notice that you're doing differently? So again, applying solution-focused principles here to the kind of counselor supervisor role. And last, we have I believe it's actually the teacher role. So after you've completed the supervisor counselor role, what part of our discussion was most helpful to you? Let's discuss strategies that I used with you, including scaling questions, exception finding questions, presuppositional questions. Pick the strategy that you've experienced the most success with and tell me how you've been able to use it successfully. Identify a strategy you've had the least success with and tell me how you will know that you're making progress with it, right? So again, more directive. It's giving ideas, giving suggestions, following up on those, being evaluative. Okay, so now that you've learned about constructivist supervision, same situation as before, this client who's intimidative. If you are a constructivist supervisor, how will you proceed with helping your counselor to assist the client or student? Pause the video and take a moment. Just like with cognitive behavioral, there's a lot of different ways you could go here. My guess is if you were taking more of a consultative role as a constructivist supervisor, you would be interested in what kinds of narratives are there. And we talked before about this idea of complainant versus, someone who's more of a customer versus more of a visitor. What is kind of the client's perspective that they're bringing in? How are they approaching therapy? And how might you help them move to different ways of being? What are the options available to you in the therapy session? If you were taking a counselor role, you may focus instead on the supervisee's own experience, right? What rating for yourself on a 1 to 10 scale, how stuck do you feel with this particular client? And if you say you're rating yourself as a 9, how do we get you to a 7? Right? What's the next step? So that's more of a kind of counseling supervisor approach. If you were doing more of the teaching role, you might be asking more specific, or at least giving more specific directives and guidance and how to handle a situation like this. Maybe you're doing role playing and things like that. Okay, so we've reviewed supervision approaches. Next, we're going to get into supervision formats. There are only a couple of these actually that really stand out, and they're pretty straightforward to talk through: individual and triadic supervision, group supervision, group peer supervision, and live supervision. Note that individual and triadic supervision is required by CACREP for site placement, our specialized accreditor. So if you're taking on our students, you must provide an hour a week of individual or triadic supervision. It cannot be group supervision. So in other words, you cannot have more than 2 people, 2 supervisees in that hour in which you've committed to providing supervision. Let's talk about the pros, cons, strengths, weaknesses of individual versus triadic supervision. So individual is just literally one-on-one, you with the supervisee. Triadic is you with 2 supervisees. So let's say you had 2 supervisees that you had in your program and you wanted to be able to do triadic supervision, you could do that. And let's just talk about pros and cons of doing it. So individual supervision, pro is more attention given to supervisees, and sensitive performance issues with a supervisee can be addressed more easily. With triadic supervision, there's more peer-to-peer learning, which is in and of itself actually quite useful in the learning process and supervision. It's also more efficient, of course, but also less flexible. What I mean by less flexible is, let's say that you're not available, you have to reschedule 2 people instead of 1, or one of the 2 people, the supervisees, is unavailable, you have to reschedule everyone. So it's just a bit more of a scheduling headache in my experience when you're doing triadic supervision. Group supervision, very commonly used at a lot of sites, can be used for multiple activities: case staffing, case presentations, written documentation, going over things like treatment plans, IEP meetings and such, kind of prepping for those, or what maybe it's things like a response to intervention meeting, or those types of things. And group supervision it can be something that the site just provides to all of its staff, and in which case the supervisee can join, or it can be something that's just set up for that experience. You're not required to do group supervision at your site. You're certainly welcome to do that, of course, but it's the individual and triadic that's the requirement for us. Some programs also implement peer supervision, group peer supervision, and this can be very effective and useful. It could also have mixed results. For example, whether or not it's going to be helpful or hindrance depends on whether peers are overly critical and judgmental or supportive. You don't want a person to be at either side of that spectrum. If they're even overly supportive, not much critical or constructive feedback is being provided, and so it's not helping each other to grow. Whereas if it's too critical or judgmental as an environment, it just puts people off, right? And they just stop showing up. To establish the conditions of this environment, the supervisor must ensure that the peer format encourages appropriate growth by talking overtly with those peers, your supervisees, about what's the kind of expected way of doing group peer supervision. So for example, being able to balance giving constructive and supportive feedback, and both being important. And also making sure that peers have a supportive attitude of each other rather than being competitive. Live supervision, lots of different ways of doing this. So we do require in our program that each and every one of our students produces video or audio tape recordings for demonstration in faculty-led group supervision at OSU, to be able to demonstrate what they're doing and get feedback from their peers. So we do use group supervision modality at Oregon State. And that's what faculty supervisors provide. In rare situations, there are situations where a site does not allow video or audio recording at all. We tend to avoid those sites, to be honest, because we don't think it's as good of an experience for our students. However, if we decided that you're one of those sites that we're more willing to work with around this requirement, You would be required to do a live supervision observation at least once a term. And here are the types of ways in which you could do live supervision. One-way mirrors, or if you have those. Video, of course, you can have the person be kind of beamed in. It's kind of called bug in the eye, where basically you're watching what's happening in the session outside of the session. Maybe there's a video kind of camera set up for that. Bug in the ear, where a person, you can kind of hear what's happening. Maybe there's a microphone in the room. Maybe even there's a headset that the supervisee has that they can kind of receive prompts from the supervisor. It's less commonly used today, but it's still available to you. Computer assisted. This could be, for example, being in a Zoom room or a DocsMe room or something like that with your client. More and more, increasingly, we're using telehealth, right, for clinical services, especially during the pandemic, which is almost over, thankfully. And also, of course, in supervision. And so certainly computer assisted, we're going to see more and more of that. And actually, in a way, it's easier for supervisors to access because they don't have to relocate if they're at a different site, for example. Can be more complicated in school situations, of course. Intercom telephone is another way of kind of listening in. You could just put it on kind of a speaker and have it so that you're kind of listening in over the phone. And intermittent consultation. That's, you've probably heard about the reflection team model, where you will have a counselor and client in a room. The supervisor is watching somewhere externally, maybe in a viewing room. Then the supervisee comes over to the supervisor and says, hey, what should I do in the last 10 minutes of the session? And then there's a discussion, then the supervisee goes back in. Again, less commonly used today, but certainly another method of live supervision. Okay, we've talked about formats. Now let's talk about supervision evaluation. I really like to highlight the importance of formative assessment and feedback, not just summative. Formative, which means giving feedback along the way, right from the beginning of an experience, say practicum or internship, all the way through the end. Early feedback gives an opportunity for calibration and correction on the part of the supervisee. They are able to understand how they're maybe not performing as best as they could. They're able to make those adjustments, and that's how they grow. It also, of course, gives you information about the supervisee's own openness to feedback. If you just wait until the end of an experience to give them feedback, right, and then you're not really able to understand how well is this person actually able to integrate feedback that I give to them. Summative assessment and feedback is given once per quarter. This is feedback on the learning outcomes, knowledge and skills, as well as dispositions. And dispositions mean things like a person's openness to feedback, even, you know, the way in which they show up on time, they complete notes on time, those types of things. And this is feedback that you would give to the faculty supervisor, they themselves submit the evaluation form. So you're not going to be required to submit an evaluation form, but you will be checked in with by the faculty supervisor, and to make sure that the rating form is kind of accurate to your perception of how the supervisee is doing on site. Okay, in terms of sources of information, you know, what would you even use as sources of information to evaluate a student or a supervisee? Well, the first, of course, is self-report. A supervisee comes in and they tell you how they're doing or how a session went. Okay, it's important. We want to get their perspective. It shouldn't be the only method of feedback. And the reason that I share that with you is, or at least of information, self-report is naturally biased, right? You only understand the supervisee's perspective. Process notes are also a way of getting information, but I think perhaps most importantly is the audio tape, videotape, and live observation, where you can actually see for yourself what's happening within the session, and then give more objective feedback, as well as a comment on the subjective feedback of the supervisee. In situations when you have a concern about the student that you're working with or supervisee, this is the process that we recommend. First, talk with that student or supervisee and disclose to them what feedback you have, right? It gives them an opportunity to turn about face, you know, to be able to make adjustments. and give them an opportunity to see if their performance improves. If no improvement occurs after several weeks, if your concerns remain, at that point, you could consult with the faculty supervisor. I think you want to give the supervisee a chance first, particularly if it's low level, like if it's something like they're not developing certain skills at the rate you want them to. That feels less crucial to me than there's been a major ethical violation at the site. I mean, if that happens, you should immediately reach out to the faculty supervisor, probably. But if it's more likely, if it's going to be a situation of just growth and development, that's when you want to give the student a chance to work on that. If you have concerns following faculty supervisor consultation, meaning you've talked with the student or the supervisee, there's been no change, you talk with the faculty supervisor and you don't feel like the consultation was helpful, or you just still don't see any change, at that point you could reach out to the clinical coordinator. Hopefully that won't happen, right? That would be a pretty significant experience in which the student's just not doing well and you're not feeling support from the program around it. But we're here for you. So you can absolutely reach out to the clinical coordinator at that point if needed. Okay, we talked about a lot today. I hope that was helpful to give you a bit of grounding going into your work with our students. We talked about expectations that we have of sites and also site supervisors and also of us as faculty supervisors. The goals of supervision, what to work on, styles and roles, the way in which you approach supervisees, supervision models, different theoretical approaches, supervision formats, individual, triadic, group, etc., and the evaluation of supervisees. That concludes this video lecture on supervising counselors in training.